Becoming a film director in the vein of someone like James Cameron or Christopher Nolan takes a lot of skill and luck, but more than anything, it demands that one just get started. Because people like Cameron now deal with budgets that can climb to more than $250 million, it's easy to forget that they all started pretty small. In this video, I want to take a look at how some famous directors got their start. The fascinating thing is that all of these directors started in different parts of the world and didn't know each other, but all of them went about making their first movie in almost the exact same way. All of these movies were also made on budgets of $25,000 or less, though it's worth keeping in mind that they were made on film. Reproducing these movies today would be a lot cheaper. James Cameron is, without a doubt, the most successful filmmaker of our time. Each of his last 3 movies have made more than $2 billion at the box office, and, as far as I'm concerned, pretty much all of his movies are classics or in the process of becoming classics. It's also rare that a sequel is as good as the first movie, but with Aliens, Terminator 2 Judgment Day, and Avatar The Way of Water, Cameron proved that it can be done, and done well. He's helped advance and revolutionized film tech as long as he's been in the industry, and certainly no one else can say that their set is as likely to kill you as often as Cameron can. After finishing high school, James Cameron enrolled in college, but that did not last long. School just wasn't for him, so he bounced around jobs. The last job that he held before entering the film industry was driving a lunch truck for the Brea Unified School District. He had a lot of free time on his hands and would use it to draw and write. But most importantly, he would use this time to learn. Cameron would, quote, go down to the USC library and pull any thesis that graduate students had written about optical printing or front screen projection or dye transfers, anything that related to film technology, end quote. He'd copy what he needed or take notes, effectively giving himself a free education in film. But this was just theory, and theory without application is useless. The application came after 1977 Star Wars. George Lucas's masterwork was the inflection point for innumerable filmmakers, including Cameron. He said that the movie pissed him off. Here was a guy doing exactly what he, James Cameron, wanted to be doing. It was time for him to put all of that knowledge to use. Cameron and 2 of his friends, Bill Wisher and Randall Frakes, both of whom would work with him on future movies, and all of whom have remained friends throughout the years, got to work on what would be their first short together, a 12-minute sci-fi called Xenogenesis. The goal was to raise money in 2 stages, one stage for the short film, and then, if the investors liked the short, to try and raise more for a feature. Now, what do you do with no experience, no equipment, no sets, nothing? You make do, of course. That's something that a lot of first-time filmmakers might not like to hear, but it's the most salient thing to take away from what Cameron and what every other director on this list did. First, they took stock of what they had or could get access to. Maybe all you can get is friends and family. Maybe you have access to a car or to a garage, or you live near a forest or on a farm. Maybe you're in a big city and the city can become a backdrop. Maybe you have no issue with just going up to someone and asking if you could use their business as a location or if they want to act in your movie. Whatever the case, assess what equipment you have, the people and locations you have access to, and your own comfort level in asking or, if necessary, begging for things, and write your script based off of that. You need to be able to work with what you have, whether your budget is $20, $20,000, or $20 million. What did James Cameron have at this point? Well, he had genuine artistic talent developed over years of drawing and painting. Cameron thought up some ideas for Xenogenesis, painted them, and brought them to a group of dentists who, in the aftermath of Star Wars, were looking to produce a small movie project. Concept art is also how Cameron sold Fox on Titanic and Avatar further down the line. He creates concept images for virtually every project and is able to convince others on their strength. The dentists invested around $20,000 in the movie, money that they would never actually see back because the movie made roughly $0.00. Shorts aren't made to make money. They're made to get your foot in the door. Cameron, Frakes, and Wisher had no experience, but they didn't let that stop them. Instead, they focused on learning on the job. They didn't have YouTube, so they read books to learn about special effects, created their own sets using cardboard, rented a camera that they had to be taught how to use because none of them had used a professional cinema camera before, and they got to work. This would be Cameron's first time directing a movie, and his intended audience, the directors, after viewing it, decided that they, in fact, did not want a feature film. They pulled out, but Cameron and his friends learned some invaluable lessons. One, they learned that they could make a short film from start to finish. Cameron learned how to build models, how to light and shoot a film, and how to work with special effects. He wouldn't let that footage go to waste either. He showed it to a producer, Chuck Comiskey, who worked with Roger Corman at New World Pictures, a legendary B-movie house that was working on a B-movie version of Star Wars called Battle Beyond the Stars. What Cameron knew now was that he wanted to be in the business. If that meant working his way up, so be it. The first feature that he would ever work on would be Battle Beyond the Stars, doing model work. His short got him a foot in the door, and from that point onwards, it was just a matter of proving his work ethic, which he did in short order. James Cameron was off to the races. It's kind of fascinating that the time between Peter Jackson's first feature, Bad Taste, and his beginning development on The Lord of the Rings is just shy of 10 years. Within a decade, Jackson went from a $25,000 budget to $281 million for the trilogy. Jackson, like Cameron, enrolled in college for a minute before dropping out. But whereas Cameron was a bit listless and looking for something to do, Jackson quickly got after what he wanted, making movies. Seemingly like Steven Spielberg, Jackson knew that he wanted to make movies as a young boy, but hailing from New Zealand, he was a bit far from the center of the action. But, as nearly every other filmmaker on this list shows, you don't need to be in LA to get started. Jackson would make short films with his family and friends and, at 16, began working as an apprentice engraver to save up money to buy a camera. Camera in hand, he knew he needed a project. Project-based learning is a tried and true method. Basically, you find something of a reasonable size and set it as a goal. It could be a short film or it could be a feature film. But without a project, you quickly find yourself wandering aimlessly. That's a dangerous place to be because while it seems like you're making progress by working through tutorials or reading or something, you're actually not making any movement in any direction. You need something concrete to work towards. For Cameron, that project was Xenogenesis. For Peter Jackson, it would be the sci-fi comedy horror Bad Taste. Similar to Cameron, Jackson took stock of what he had available. One was the location, Pecora Bay. You get the shots of the bay, the beach, nearby woods, some hills, and some wonderful effects. The movie, made in 1987, was made using a 16mm camera from the 1960s. If Peter Jackson does not need the latest and greatest, no one does. He used what he had available to him. His camera couldn't even record sound. All of that had to be dubbed in later. He also took on the bulk of the responsibilities himself. He directed, wrote, produced, starred, acted as his own cinematographer, built the models, created the special effects, and edited the movie. The movie began life as a short film, but evolved into a feature film that Jackson would work on for 4 years, mostly on weekends and after work when friends and neighbors were also available. Most everyone chipped in for free. About the only things that he couldn't get for free were things like the film reels and raw materials for building the effects and models. Necessity being the mother of all invention and lacking the funds to purchase equipment, Jackson and his friends made everything from scratch. Tracks, a dolly, a crane to get shots from a cliff top, even a Steadicam. Jackson and his friends built what they needed from scratch. Sure, it wasn't the highest quality, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to get the job done. That extended to the props. They had a mallet made of sponge, a fake machete that had a pipe in it to carry the fake blood, and guns that were made of aluminum tubing with holes cut out, wood, and cardboard and held together by glue. And what did they do to get the recoil effect from the gun? They shook it as they pretended to shoot. Muzzle flash was then added in post-production. That's it. What they lacked in capital, they made up for with sheer creativity. The result is a fun, splattery romp through Jackson's backyard that took him to Cannes. It put him well on his way to eventually taking on the greatest filmic endeavor of the 20th century, something that would consume years of his life. The work ethic of sticking with the project and figuring out problems as they came along prepared him well for The Lord of the Rings. Christopher Nolan's first feature, Following, cost just $6,000 in the late 90s. That's still less than $12,000 today. As his debut, Nolan wanted to keep the cost down because, of course, you don't go all out in terms of cost on your very first outing. Nolan did almost everything Peter Jackson did on Bad Taste: directing, writing, producing, cinematography, and editing. About the only thing he didn't do was acting and special effects, but then again, the latter is something that Peter Jackson, as well as James Cameron, have a special interest in. The movie has a non-linear structure, which is something Nolan has returned to time and again for movies like Memento, Tenet, and Oppenheimer, and was shot in black and white. Partly, it was a stylistic choice, but as importantly, it was just cheaper, and that is the name of the game when you're filming a no-budget feature. Nolan didn't have much to work with. In fact, it was as though he had even less to work with than Peter Jackson. Unlike Cameron and Jackson, Nolan went to and completed college. He earned an English degree from University College London. By the time he was old enough to go to college, he knew that he wanted to make movies. Like Jackson, he'd been making shorts since he was a kid on his father's Super 8 camera. It might seem odd, then, that he chose English, but that was on a bit of advice from his father, who said that he should pursue something that wasn't filmmaking in order to get a different perspective. It was obviously very good advice, because Nolan has written almost all of his directed films, and in order to be a great writer, you need to be a prolific reader. And just because you have interests outside of film doesn't mean you're not devoted to pursuing it as your vocation. In fact, you should have various interests. Not only can they feed into whatever your main goal is, but it's just a lot more fun. Nolan said that they used a handheld camera and only worked with the available light that they had. That was because they couldn't afford any extra lighting. They could just afford the sun, and this being England, that wasn't always a guarantee either. Everyone that worked on the film also had day jobs, and the only days that they could get together were Saturdays. So what did they do? They made it work. They got together every Saturday for a full year in order to get the shots that they needed. Nolan specifically wrote the film to match his constraints. In his words, quote, "Following was always planned as an ultra-low budget film, so the substance of the film was both inspired by and planned around the shooting style, which we developed to accommodate our limited resources," end quote. That means he considered what he had access to and worked around that. He also only had enough money to get 1 or 2 takes of each shot, which meant that extensive rehearsals were necessary so that the actors could nail it on the first try. He said that, quote, "Locations were begged, borrowed, and stolen," end quote, with most of the shoots done in their friends' apartments or his parents' house. Again, he used what he had access to. Following won critical acclaim and showed off Nolan's talent. It's proof positive that you don't need a lot of money to make a great feature. Too often, when people say that they want to make a movie, they mean that they want to make a blockbuster like they see in theaters. Well, that's where one usually wants their movies to end up. The first feature always needs to be much more pared down. Consider what you have access to and write around that, instead of immediately jumping for something heavy with special effects. Unless, of course, you have the skill to create those effects yourself. But that doesn't mean that you can't do an action movie on a budget. After all, that's exactly what Robert Rodriguez did just a few years before Christopher Nolan with his feature debut, El Mariachi. Rodriguez was just 23 years old when he directed the movie. Famously, in order to raise the money for the movie, he donated his body to science, as in he would donate blood and plasma. For El Mariachi, he spent a month in a research hospital. They paid $3,000 and provided room and board for a month. In Rebel Without a Crew, he wrote, quote, "I needed someplace quiet to write and earn money at the same time," end quote, so this ended up being perfect. As an aside, if you only read one book on making movies, read Rebel Without a Crew. It might even be all that you need, because it's basically a journal of making the movie and how quickly everything happened for Rodriguez. He entered the trial in early June of 1991 and got out of the trial on July 3rd, 1991. His script for El Mariachi was finished on July 8th. While in the trial, he wrote out the broad strokes and began writing part of the script on yellow legal paper, but was only able to finish it once he got out. He lacked 2 things, money and manpower. He made up the difference with hustle, an intense work ethic, and a lot of pre-production. Pre-production was probably the most important aspect of making El Mariachi. Like Nolan, there was zero margin for error. He had to get everything done in 1 or 2 takes. And, like Nolan, Jackson, and Cameron, he kept what he had access to in mind. It's something I've repeated, but only because it's the most important thing. A lot of people that want to make movies think of what they want in the movie and then try to get it. That can end up backfiring. What you want might not be available, or if it is, it might be too expensive to get. Rodriguez went the other way. He looked at what he had access to and wrote that into the movie. He shot the film in Acuña, a city situated on the border between Texas and Mexico. While he was in the research hospital, his friend, Carlos, was doing location scouts and found some places for them: a local jail, a hotel, a club, and a ranch. So all of these locations went into the script for El Mariachi. They were able to get access to guns and blanks from the local police, so guns were also in the script. In order to give the movie the appearance of having more guns than they actually had, they used water guns. The guards and the warden that you see in the movie are also the actual guards and the actual warden of the jail at the time, and they volunteered for the role. I think a lot of people underestimate what others are willing to say yes to. A lot of people will, for free, agree to a fun, novel experience. I can understand that asking is the hardest thing, but the worst that can happen is that people say no, and a lot of times they say yes. The first day of filming was Wednesday, July 31st, 1991. The last day of shooting was Tuesday, August 20th, 1991. 3 weeks in Mexico changed the entire trajectory of Robert Rodriguez's life. In 3 weeks, he had gone from an idea in his head to 25 10-minute rolls of film or 250 minutes of footage to work with. In 3 weeks, he had the makings of a film, and he did it with equipment that's more expensive, more cumbersome, and more annoying to deal with than what we use now. What Rodriguez had was boundless creativity and a conviction that the perfect must not be the enemy of the good. That bears repeating. Do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Good enough is good enough. That means cut corners and find novel solutions. Like Peter Jackson, Rodriguez didn't have access to a dolly. Jackson built his own, while Rodriguez used a wheelchair and had someone push and pull him. He also couldn't get a bunch of fancy lights, so he used what was available, the sun and natural lighting, and when shooting interior shots, 2 200-watt clip-on desk lamps. Also similar to Jackson, he had to act as his own sound guy. After shooting a take, he would redo it in order to get the sound. It was a pain in the ass to synchronize it in post, and it took forever, but that's exactly what Rodriguez had to do. Then, to sell it, he started cold calling, just asking people to watch the movie. It eventually landed with an agent at ICM whose only connection to Rodriguez was that he and Rodriguez were supposed to be at the same film festival, but the guy never showed up. They never even met before this. Rodriguez just knew his name and worked off of that. That's the name of the game for anyone that wants to make movies: creativity, confidence, and some small modicum of bluster. You might have noticed a few commonalities between everybody on this list. One is that they're all writer-directors. James Cameron, Peter Jackson, Christopher Nolan, Robert Rodriguez, as well as directors that I didn't get to in this video like Shane Carruth, David Lynch, Richard Linklater, Darren Aronofsky, Justin Benson, Aaron Moorhead, and Kevin Smith are all writer-directors. Each of them wrote the story and screenplay and directed the movie. This is important because only you know what you have access to or can get access to. Consider that when writing your own screenplay. Second, they all had to make do with as little as possible. You probably won't be able to access a nice dolly or crane as a first-time filmmaker. That means that you have two choices. The first is make what you need out of raw materials or get creative. That's what Peter Jackson and Robert Rodriguez did. If you don't know how to, find someone who does. Beg someone who does have access if you need to. The second option is to make do without that shot as you envisioned it. Not everything needs to be perfect and nothing is beneath you, especially getting that one shot you really want. And third, they all just got started. James Cameron has a great quote on what it means to be a director. Quote, "The main thing is just picking up a camera and making a film. That's the most important thing." People say, how do you get to be a filmmaker? I say, go home, pick up your video camera, and make a film. Well, it's on video. It doesn't matter. But it's an image. You're deciding what goes into that image. People say, well, where am I going to get the money? F the money. Get some people and just make a film. Because if you make a film and you put your name on it that says directed by, even if it's the worst piece of crap in the world and costs no money, everything after that, you're a director. You're just haggling over your price. You know what I mean? And the budget, it scales up from there. But you've defined yourself in that role. If you can't define yourself in that role to yourself, then you're just chipping away at it, not really doing it." End quote. A lot of people get stuck in tutorial hell because it's a comfortable place to be. You keep learning, watching YouTube videos on how to choose the right camera and lens and get the sound right, and how to cast and get permission and whatever else. But the most important thing is to just get started. Output matters more than anything. Keep churning things out and you'll eventually land on something that's closed the gap between where you are and where you want to be. It's never going to be comfortable or easy. Look at Cameron. Each of his last 3 movies were separated by 10 years. If it's not easy for him, it's not going to be easy for anyone. But if Robert Rodriguez can make a movie like El Mariachi in a couple of months, if guys like Sylvester Stallone can bang out a screenplay for movies like Rocky in 3 days, there's no reason that anyone else can't do the same. Filmmaking is not an innate skill. It's learned like anything else. And the best way to learn anything is trial by fire.